Hello everyone, good evening. Welcome to this panel on basic income. My name's Sara Hill. I'm a former director of Opus Independence, the people behind the Festival of Debate. So I'm one of the people that helped set it up originally, which is why it's really lovely for me to come back and be involved in tonight. So I'll be chairing for you this evening. The Festival of Debate really has came out of a desire to promote more positive conversations around social, political and economic issues of our day, kind of to try and move beyond the angry rants in the pub, and an attempt to look at ways that we can constructively move forward and look at implementing social change together. So that's the context for the Festival of Debate. You're all aware that we're here for the Basic Income Evening. Just a little word about Opus Independence. Opus Independence is a social enterprise, not-for-profit, has been operating in Sheffield since 2008. As well as the Festival of Debate, they publish Now Then magazine, run Word Life, which is, I think, South Yorkshire's largest live literature organisation. So do have a look at opusindependence.com and see what else they do, because they're fabulous. So a little bit of housekeeping for this evening. The ladies' toilets are just the other side of this curtain behind the stage. The men's toilets just the other side. Your fire exit is the only entrance and exit that you came in. We are filming this evening, as you will notice. If you're not comfortable with being filmed, that's completely fine. The lovely Joe, who's up here, if you just make yourselves known to him at some point during the evening, he can make sure you don't end up in any film that is made public. So, just remains for me to introduce our esteemed panel. We have Dr. Kitty Stewart, Associate Director for the Centre of Analysis of Social Exclusion and Associate Professor of the Department of Social Policy at the London School of Economics. Professor Andrew Gamble, formerly a Professor of Politics at the University of Sheffield and University of Cambridge, now Chair of the International Advisory Board of the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute. Try saying that 5 times fast. Jonathan Bartley, the New Green Party co-leader and a disability rights campaigner. He was the Vice Chair of the Electoral Reform Society and served as Chair of Centre for Studies on Inclusive Education. And also Dr. Simon Duffy, founder and director of the Centre for Welfare Reform and representing Basic Income UK. He's a philosopher and social innovator who has worked for over 25 years to try and improve the welfare system. So I'm really excited to hear what all of these people have to say about basic income, and I hope you are too. So you won't hear very much from me. I'm going to let our esteemed panel take the brunt of it. We're going to start with a very basic left to right across the panel with 3 to 5 minutes of introduction about what each of our panellists feels about basic income, their position on it, and then we're going to open up to the floor for questions. There will be a roving mic at that time as well, so make sure at that point you get the mic and you stand up and you speak really clearly so everyone can hear you. So, over to our panel. Jonathan Bartley on the left-hand side.
It's good to be on the left. Actually, I'm feeling really intimidated by Kitty here. I was at the London School of Economics, and Kitty teaches there. I feel like I'm an undergraduate again in a tutorial. When I was a kid, long before I went to the London School of Economics, we were told that a day was coming when technology would improve, when we'd have great growth. It would come to a point where we'd all be so much more wealthy that we would be able to work less, we'd be able to spend more time with our friends and our family, and we'd have higher wages, and everything would be great. 40 years on, that reveals my age, 40 years on, we've had that growth, we've had that technological advancement, but actually what we've seen is growing inequality. And we've seen a huge lie around austerity. And we know that there is enough money in the 5th richest economy in the world, but the problem is that the money is in the wrong hands. And I think we're reaching a point, and I'm going to address this kind of from a political perspective as the politician on the panel. I think we're at the point post-EU referendum and what we've seen with Donald Trump, where there is a real movement for change, and people are fed up with the economic orthodoxy. They're fed up with the lies that they've been sold during the EU referendum around austerity, and they are crying out for something different. And in the vote for the EU referendum, we saw a howl of rage, particularly from the north of England, from communities who have been neglected by both left and right. A howl of rage for the first time, in the safe seats in the north. We know that in many places you could pin a red rosette on a donkey and they'd still get elected. And the result has been that Labour have not concentrated on those areas. The Conservatives have neglected them because they knew they didn't need to have to win those areas in order to win a general election. It was just the few 100,000 voters in swing seats who determined who our government would be, and that's where all the money went, that's where all the attention went. And people are now fed up. And when it came to the EU referendum, for the first time, people knew that their vote would really count. First time, some people in generations. And boy, did they make their feelings known. There was a howl of rage. And I think that's the same thing that we're seeing in the States. And we have an opportunity now for change. And I believe that the basic income, its moment has come, its time has come, with the globalization, with the changing employment market. And I think people have clocked that actually there's a very, very rich 1%, but the basic income is an opportunity to redistribute. Now, there are a number of ways that we could do a basic income. And I was doing an event earlier today on it, and we were asked, at what level would you set it? Well, it comes down to how much we want to redistribute. There's one level that we can amalgamate all the benefits, maybe take out disability benefit, maybe take out housing benefit, but try and amalgamate all the benefits into a basic income, maybe running at around 60 to 70 pounds a week. Or we can make it much more progressive. We can claw back a lot of money from the higher rate earners. We can get rid of the upper threshold on national insurance contributions and tackle the scandal of the private pensions industry, where we're pouring in £40 billion a year to the city, which is the same as they pay out every year, and basically subsidising this huge, great gravy train. We can call a halt to that. There is enough money, and we can redistribute it, and we can create this real social security. And it just requires the political will. I know there are problems and complexities with how it would work in practice. We know that there have been real challenges over amalgamating just 6 benefits around universal credit. That has meant that universal credit has been delayed by years. But I believe we can learn from those. But it actually, at its core, requires the political will. How many people have seen Cathy Come Home, the 1966 film, the precursor to I, Daniel Blake? Anyone? You remember that at the end of the film, they flash up on the screen. West Germany has created double the number of homes than Britain has since the end of the Second World War. West Germany, that lost the Second World War, has created double the number of homes. It just hit me. They took that political step and they built those homes. We did the same thing actually in the UK around the NHS and welfare state. We were in debt to the tune of 250% of our gross domestic product after the Second World War. That's compared to 80% of our gross domestic product now. The debt was 3 times the amount as a proportion of GDP after the Second World War. But we came together, we built the welfare state, the modern welfare state, we established the modern NHS because we knew that things had to change. The old order was no longer an option. Business as usual was not an option. We needed something better, and we committed to it and we created it. And I believe we can do exactly the same thing with the basic income, and I do believe that this is the moment and its time has come. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So my view, in short, is that basic income is a brilliant idea, fantastic idea, until you read the small print and look at the detail and the costings, which I think we have to do. And then it's one, as someone has said, it's an idea that the more you look at the detail, the less brilliant you think it is. Now, the reason why I think it would be great is I'd love to get rid of the stigma and humiliation of means testing, and our system is riven with means testing far more than many other European countries. And I think it would be a lovely world in which people had real choices about what they want to do with their time, whether that's caring for relatives or other people, or doing things which are not valued by the market, such as art or gardening or surfing. But there is a basic problem, which is that people's lives are complex. We're all different. We have different needs, and households are shaped and sized differently. And the social security system, as it is now, is very, very complex. But it's complex largely because it's responding to those different needs and trying to meet the needs of people who have them. So what that means for basic income is either we need to design the basic income at a level which is high enough to meet the neediest family at the moment, which is very, very high and completely impossible economically to do it that way, or it means that there's going to be losers. There are going to be many losers. So if we take a full basic income scheme and replace most of our means-tested benefits, although not housing benefits, there are some really nice simulations done, actually, by Howard Reed and Stuart Lansley, who are very sympathetic to the cause of this, and they've looked really carefully at the numbers. And their simulations, their full scheme, would mean spending tens of billion pounds, 40 or 50 billion pounds, to see child poverty rise by 8 to 10 percentage points, because it couldn't replace the level of income which some households with children now receive. And to me, and I know, and I research the effects of child poverty on children's lives today and on their future life chances and opportunities. As soon as I see that, I just think I'm out. We can't have a system where we raise tens of billion pounds and spend it in order to increase child poverty to that level. The option is to have a partial scheme where we leave some of our means-tested benefits in place and put the universal scheme on top of that. And their simulations show that can be designed so that we reduce child poverty, and we still manage to take some families out of means testing. So we reduce the level of means testing to some degree. Perhaps a fifth fewer families would be means tested. But the cost of doing that is enormous. So one of their estimates is £150 billion, which they say we could raise by abolishing the personal tax allowance and raising all of the income tax rates by 5 pence in the pound. So I would be delighted to abolish the personal tax allowance and raise all those tax rates. I agree that we should be doing more redistribution, but with £150 billion, I think there are far more transformative things we could be doing with that money than a basic income scheme, which would give £71 a week to adults. So £71 a week isn't really enough to give many people choices about caring and about doing all the things we'd like them to be able to do. It's too small for that. I think we could be spending that money on all sorts of things. The NHS, creating better jobs, investing in public social housing and having that at affordable levels, because I think the housing crisis is partly what's pushing people to have to work harder all the time. So there's a huge shopping list. It'd be great to have £150 billion. I wouldn't spend it giving £71 to every adult in the country. Just one way in which I am very in favour of a universal basic income, though, is a universal child benefit. I think that's an exception. I think that's different. I would like to see us restoring child benefit to be universal and making it much more generous. That, I think, is politically and economically a lot more feasible and would have many of the benefits of a basic income for families with children, providing them with that security of income. And I just wish we could take all the energy that's being generated towards a basic income and channel it to achieving a more generous universal child benefit.
Okay, well, I mean, my starting point really is the welfare state, and the fact that the welfare state is under huge pressure at the present time, huge political pressure, has been since the 2008 financial crisis, and in some ways it's been the welfare state has been under pressure since the 1970s, as we've had a continuous era of retrenchment and reorganisations and questioning of the how generous the welfare state can be. And I think that this political context is crucial for thinking about basic income. The Declan Gaffney, who's an opponent of basic income, summarised the promise of basic income in the following way. He said it would mean no means testing of benefits, no poverty traps, no out-of-work claimants afraid to take up short-term job offers, no intrusive testing of benefit eligibility, no punitive sanctions regime, no fraud, no gaming of a system, sweeping away of bureaucracy, greater flexibility and freedom. And you'd think, well, what not to like? And then he goes on and lists all the problems, rather, as Kitty has done. And I I accept that there are some really big problems about implementation of basic income. And many of the things Kitty was saying, I mean, I recognise there's very serious practical issues in basic income. But what attracts me about the idea of basic income is that at this stage of the history of the welfare state, what we need is to find political ways to renew the social contract, to renew the idea about democratic citizenship. Some of the ideas that went, some of the idealism and the passion that went into the creation of the welfare state at the beginning, we've lost on the way. And I think that we, and it may be that basic income is not the right idea, but it seems to me that we really should explore it, because we do need some big ideas in order to reignite the political support for an extended welfare state and for stopping the salami slicing and the gradual squeezing of the welfare state and the making it increasingly less generous over the years. So my view is basic income is an idea which in many ways lies at the very heart of the original welfare state, the basic giving of people basic security and opportunity. And we ought, by thinking through the issues of basic income, I think we go back to where the welfare state began. And so that's why I'm a conditional supporter of basic income.
What to say? I think my point builds on Andrew's point, really. I think that there are all sorts of proponents of basic income, and there actually are all sorts of versions. So while one of its virtues is apparent simplicity, actually you can vary it, you can come up with all sorts of different versions of it. I don't think that's the critical point. I think the critical point is the politics of this and the kind of vision you have for the kind of society you want to be. I suppose the problem I have with Kitty's analysis is that there seems to be an assumption that the state and the welfare state and our leaders might take some benign interest in the welfare of the poorest, and that's what they've been doing for the last few decades. But I read recently I read a think tank report by a London-based think tank, very well known one, I won't say their name. They had the income of the poorest wrong by a factor of 250%. The poorest 6 million people in this country live on, after tax, £40 a week. £40 a week. Income inequality has doubled in a generation. If you go back to think about 1985 and compare the poorest 10% with the richest 10%, it's the difference is by 1 to 7. It's now 1 to 13. So money is not being smartly addressing the issues of child poverty. Money is swilling towards the better off. And it's driven by, yes, the politics of the 1%, but I think, and Jonathan touched on this, actually it's even more driven by, in my opinion, the politics of pandering to the middle classes. If you look at the marginal rate of tax in the system, it actually bottoms out in the middle, where people on moderate incomes actually pay next to no marginal tax, increase in tax. If you look at the appalling behaviour of our previous government, where they, in 5 years, they managed to cut the incomes of the poorest 10% by 9%. But if you're a middle earner during those years, you actually saw your income go up by a modest degree. So the point is here that there's not this benign technical system that's desperately trying to sort out child poverty. There's a bunch of bastards who are basically making people's lives miserable and are going in the opposite direction of social justice. So how do we get back to some degree of social justice? Well, one of the things we need is some coherent and universal account of what a fair, decent system of income security looks like. So for me, that's the starting point, and there are then a whole series of questions, and that degree, Kitty is right, you've got to look at all sorts of questions. For me, I think people with disabilities could be integrated in a system of basic income, but you'll need a kind of basic income plus, and therefore you'll need some assessment criteria. And I don't think you need the crappy Atos Maximus terrible thing we've got at the moment, but you need something which combines a reasonable degree of self-assessment, some correlation with medical notes, etc. You know, there are ways of doing this in the spirit of basic income, and similarly with housing, actually, which again is pushed out, but there are ways of giving people decent housing entitlements that can be done in the spirit of basic income and can actually give people power, control and flexibility. What all of this requires is the will to tackle, I say, not just the wealth that's accrued by the 1%, but tackle some of the self-interests of the middle classes themselves. That's the most difficult political challenge, but that's also why the basic approach of basic income, which is to take a more universal approach and say there's something in this for everyone, is fundamentally part of the appeal and will be fundamentally part of a kind of new politics of social justice.
Well, that was a pretty good start, eh? We'd like to kind of throw it open now. Thank you to all of our panellists for a great introduction. A few things that kind of came out of that for me, although I don't want to steer the discussion, was that there was a lot about practicalities as opposed to principles and philosophy. I think, Kitty started with, it's a great idea, but... so maybe one of the things that might be good to explore this evening in a group is some of those practicalities around the nitty-gritty of basic income. But a few ground rules. There's no such thing as a stupid question. If you're thinking about it, someone else in the room probably is too. It's probably me. That's completely fine. There is a roving microphone. If you could just wait till you get the microphone and stand up when you speak, that'd be really helpful for everybody. And yeah, great. And we've got straight away, right in the front.
Hello, I'm Catherine, and thank you so much. It's really great to hear all of what you said. Basically, it strikes me that there's two things. There's what we want to achieve, and there's how we do it. And what we want to achieve can be informed by our values, which it sounds like they're shared values, and then how we do it. As a Green Party member, I feel that needs to be based on evidence, as well as the values about what we want to achieve. So my questions really are the assumptions that are made in the models that Kitty talks about. How much do you feel those assumptions, given what you've said about the data, are those assumptions that tell us that basic income wouldn't work? Do you feel confident of those assumptions in the model? And the point you raised about children, if you could skew it so that there's a basic income for children that would mitigate the risk of child poverty for children while still having a basic income for adults, could the answer to your question about, well, if bringing in a basic income causes child poverty, could you skew it in favour of children quite actively with that simple measure? And also, is there a short-term versus long-term impact? So if the short-term impact is that more children are in child poverty, is there a longer-term impact by addressing the inequality that maybe the models aren't showing when you look at them immediately? Sorry for 3 questions.
Sure, yes. Sure, good question. Yes, in answer to, do I kind of believe the models? Yes, I think these are very experienced researchers. They're sympathetic to the position. I mean, they started off wanting, I think, to show that this could work. And so I do believe their models, and they do find that it can work. We could have one, but it's very, very, as I said, it's very, very expensive. And you can do it so that you skew it towards reducing child poverty, but then it becomes even more expensive. So what we'd have to agree, so we could do it, but we'd have to agree that to get rid of the personal tax allowance and put the taxes up and put all that money into the basic income. And my worry is that we've got public services which are creaking, the NHS, we know, is desperate for money. Social housing is a disaster, and we should be investing in that very, very heavily and very urgently. And so I feel like we're maxing out kind of maxing the credit, not credit cards, but we're maxing out all of the money that we can possibly raise in the system and putting it into this one scheme, if we want to do it in a way which reduces child poverty. In response to the short-term, long-term thing, I think the problem is with children that there isn't a long-term. You know, I've really felt this very strongly during this austerity period, because children, particularly young children, have felt the burden of austerity more than any other group. And I feel, you know, you hear this rhetoric, let's tighten our belts, and we've got to do this for now, and in the long run it'll be okay. And for children, that's their childhood, those years. You don't get that back. And if you spend your, 0 to 10 living in poverty with highly stressed parents who don't focus on you because they've got too many other worries, that has long-term consequences for you. So I really feel that morally we can't afford to allow child poverty to be high for a short period. And I guess that's my answer. Did I answer all the three? I can't.
Let's get a bit of debate going here. It feels, Kitty, like everything you're saying is against the backdrop of austerity, and that seems to be the implicit assumption. If you look at Germany, they're spending 43% of their gross domestic product on public expenditure. We're heading down to 36% maybe in this country. If we just came up to Germany's level, that's another £100 billion in the coffers. This is not a socialist republic. This is just common sense. Like Germany, we can find that money. And everything you said is like we just have to operate within the confines of what the government has set down in terms of public expenditure. You know, the 100 and, what's the welfare budget now? It's about 120, 200 billion. Well, if you're taking out pensions, and you're talking about 150 billion. I mean, if you can find another 150 billion, you don't have to spend 205 billion renewing Trident. You can take out that 40 billion subsidy that goes into the private pension industry. You can put in a wealth tax, maybe producing a conservative estimate 20 billion a year. You could have a financial transaction tax of 30 billion a year, and you can claw back. If you're giving the basic income as an unconditional benefit to everyone, you can then claw it back through a higher rate of tax. That's not a problem. No one loses. It is about political will. Now, in terms of how we do it, you need a pilot. Clearly, we've seen all the problems over universal credit. No one's saying this is a simple thing at all. But there are versions of basic income, perhaps less complicated, not the full basic income max, going on in various places in the world to see what happens. There are complexities such as how you safeguard national insurance contributions when you try a pilot in a region. But I think until we start to pilot it and see what the effects are, and then analyze and feed back in, I don't think we can kind of reach those conclusions that it's unworkable. And IPPR, are running 20 different models of basic income. They now have the modelling to run 20 different models. Compass have produced 3 different models, in their recent report, which come to very different conclusions to yours. So, this evidence is contested, and I would just challenge the frame that you're operating in, the modelling is operating in.
Maybe get a bit unfair. Can I make I just want to. We have an half-assed basic income system anyway, don't we? I mean, it is a kind of funny, this conversation. You've got child benefit set at a certain level. That's a basic income for children. Well, yes, the terrible government have just chiselled away, but for a long time it was, and it was successfully defended as such. And what's happened with pension reform effectively is that after decades of government fiddling around trying to incentivise us to save, they've realised most of us can't, and so have just shored up the basic pension, which is a form of basic income. So the key group, although we need to restore universal child benefit or in some better form, the key group is in the middle. And what do we have in the middle? Well, we have a crazy mixture of benefits, now the new universal credit, tax credits, tax allowances, and all sorts of other allowances. The biggest subsidy, of course, is an appallingly low interest rate, which means that the rich can borrow at next to no cost, hence driving the housing bubble. So we have a whole series of things that we do. We advantage one group here and one group there. Broadly, the system is hugely disadvantaged to the poorest and very beneficial to the better off. And that's where the critical engineering would be. 2 points. From my point of view, I've argued that the key step technically is to scrap the Department of Work and Pensions. Actually, what universal credit is a crazy attempt to maintain two government departments to do roughly the same job. When Gordon Brown invented tax credits, I asked James Parnell why had they allowed tax credits to be in HMRC. He said because Gordon Brown insisted his department would do a much better job than the DWP. So basically you have Whitehall departments designing systems rivaling each other. I mean, tax credits has been a disaster. It has led to huge deficits. So this is just mad, crazy Whitehall stuff. Get rid of one of the departments and get one department in the business of redistributing income. Yvette Cooper, I remember saying to me on a panel like this, saying, well, we can't do that, Simon. We can't integrate tax and benefits because they work to different taxonomies. In other words, one's based around families, one's based around individuals. Well, change it, integrate it. That's the key technical step that would have to be made. Once you do that, then you have a series of other decisions to make about the levels you set and you know the marginal tax rates, if any, that are in the system. The key empirical question, which none of these models will ever really answer, what will answer it is reality, is what happens when people's income security goes up. And we'll find out. But we see it with older people now on their state pensions. There's plenty of them willing to go out to work. So there's really, this is the direction of travel, partly because the craziness of the current design is unsustainable. So politicians eventually, I think it was, somebody said, you know, politicians eventually do the right thing after they've tried every other feasible alternative. And that's the process we're in the end game of now.
Just a quick thing, which is, I mean, it seems to me that there's a prior question, which is, but if we really want, but if basic income is a direction of travel that we want to go in the direction of, one of the political conditions for it is that the argument has to be one for higher rates of taxation, because if that isn't one, then I think actually it's very, very difficult to see how basic income or any other improvement to the welfare state can actually take place. And one of the problems that we have a political culture in which it's for decades now, it's become almost impossible to consider the raising of the main sources of taxation in this country. There's been various stealth taxes and various other ways of in which the revenue's been increased, but the main forms of taxation, there's been huge electoral resistance to raising them, and governments of all parties have shied away from it. And it seems to me that if we want a much more generous welfare state, then we have that battle has to be won, and we have to have politicians who stand up and fight for that.
Thank you. A lot of that obviously started in response to something that you'd said, Kitty. So did you want the chance to respond to that?
Well, only to say that I think it's not true at all to say that I'm operating within the confines of austerity and the current 36% or whatever we're trying to aim for. I completely disagree. I said I think we should. I'm all for higher rates of taxation, and I'd like to see the size of the state increase. But I just think that doing that, raising all of that money, and then spending it. I don't think this is the right way to spend it. I think you'll give. Have to be spent like that. That's,
well, just to show that there is money available. You can also invest in the NHS. It's not an either or.
Well, it is an either or once you look at the numbers that are there. Unless you're going to say, let's. So we got rid of the personal tax allowances and we added 5 pence on the pound. That's going to the basic income. Now, in order to put any money into the NHS, to think about social care for the elderly, a universal system for them would be nice to see, social housing, all of the other things, we've got to add up, another 5, another 10 pence. And as Andrew
said, based on 43% of gross domestic product, is it, like the level of Germany? This is a model that's based on 36% plus a bit of marginal tax.
No, it's not. It's.
Is that 43%? That's the model, is it?
I don't know whether it's 43%, but I'm saying you've got rid of. If we're going to put I can't remember what the tax rates in Germany are off the top of my head, but if you're going to get rid of the personal tax, so there's no personal tax allowance. Germany has one of those, and then you're going to have a 25p rate, a 40. The top rate of tax in Germany is certainly no more than 50 pence. I mean, it's all very well. We can have a discussion in which we say, let's have motherhood and apple pie and we'll have millions of things. Clearly, if you raise however much money you raise, you've got choices in how to spend it. Yeah. In my view, there are far more urgent things that we could be spending it on. And I think would be better placed to make the case for higher rates of taxation if we explain I think there is more of an appetite out there for a decently funded NHS, for social housing, which would reduce housing costs, and for, I can think of some other things as well, than £71 a week, which is not transformative, which is not enough for people to live on. It's well below a poverty line. So, there are choices. We can have a nice conversation and pretend there are no choices, but there are choices.
There are choices, but the £71 a week is from getting rid of the personal tax allowance, but amalgamating the existing benefits, excluding housing benefit and disability benefit, based on 36% of gross domestic product. Now, if you have another 100 billion on top of that to raise it to the level of Germany's public expenditure, that is your money for the NHS as well as an increase in the basic income.
No, because you've got to tackle child poverty, because your version has child poverty going up, so you've got to.
Plus, you can have a hybrid system where you provide additional payments for child poverty. I mean, what I'm saying is, the broad picture is there is enough money to do this. It isn't like we're going to have to suddenly, break the bank. The lie of austerity has taken us to a place where we believe we're bankrupt, and we only have to look at Germany to know that if we just did what Germany did, we would have another 100 billion, to play with. And if we went a bit further and went to another country's example, we would have, another 100 billion on top of that to play with. It is about the choices that we make, but it isn't a choice between basic income and the NHS. There is so much more money there that if we want to go and get it, and it does come down to political will. We are far less in debt than we were at the end of the Second World War. We can borrow to fund it because we know that when you spend this money, you pump it into the economy. We know there's excess capacity in the economy, and when we spend £1, we get £1.50 back. We know that there's a multiplier effect. So actually, you can borrow if you need to in order to do it. It doesn't have to come even from public expenditure. It comes down to the political will.
I'm going to have to ring a bell on that particular one eventually, so we can take another question from the floor, although I am certain we will come back to it. The first hand I saw go up was that gentleman in the peach jumper there. Oh, well, okay then. John's the boss, really.
Sorry. My question's more sort of philosophical, really. I mean, we've been talking about welfare states and stuff, but no one's mentioned technology, which is, is transforming, is going to continue to transform the world, and how we deal with the fact that production is not really going to be an option. We're not going to be able to bring back production jobs here because it's going to get to a point where it nearly is there already, where 10% of the world population can produce enough goods for the rest of the world. And so how we deal with that is going to be a huge thing, and I think basic income is one of the ways we could possibly deal with it. And I think another element of why I think it's important is, again, we need a sort of big vision, because there's, as we can see in the political world, there's real jeopardy in what's happening in the world at the moment. And unless we do something dramatic, there's a good chance we're going to repeat the same mistakes that were made in the early 20th century. I mean, a lot of things are repeating themselves. So we can argue about the minutiae of how we do it, or we can actually really commit to a project of doing it. And I think it's just, it's just a reality that there's not going to be enough work in the old sense for people to do and to bring in income. And we're going to need another way for people to get income. And that's going to have to be for, either basic income or something else.
Okay, Simon made eyes at that one, so I'm going to pass the mic to him.
Well, I really want to agree with the point about the parallels with the 1930s. The philosopher Hannah Arendt described the underlying condition which in the end led to, the horror of the Holocaust, terror, war, and all the revolution, and which in a sense gave birth to the welfare state, as effectively the key ingredient to this was rootlessness, insecurity. It's not strictly poverty. Even the 1930s was a dreadful time in terms of sheer wealth, material wealth. It was much better than 50 years earlier. So understanding these things in terms of kind of straightforward materialistic models doesn't work. You've got to understand the psychology of people, and what's going on in society, I think, is repeating those patterns from the 1930s. We're not quite there yet, but I think it is very similar in the very worrying trends of blaming and scapegoating and looking outward for enemies. And, you know, it took a bloody world war for us to reach the point of thinking, you know what, we need to secure ourselves. We have obligations to each other. We need to commit ourselves. The idea of a national health service seemed as absurd as basic income seems now in the 1930s. And now it seems, although there are still some people trying to chip away at it, a straightforward moral feature of life that we should make sure everybody gets decent health care. And we're heading to the point where I think, although there will be many who will still be frightened or worried or skeptical, where it'll start to feel obvious that we need to secure people's basic economic conditions through secure income. And that's the fundamental purpose of basic income, isn't it? We talk about it as the state giving us, but it's really our commitment to each other, isn't it? It's to say we are committed to each other. We're using the state for this purpose. We're using these instruments, taxation or whatever, to try and pull down the incomes of the rich and lift. Actually, the positive money people would point out you could even think about this in radically different ways as well. So there's a whole series of different ways of thinking about what's going on. But at its moral root, it's a commitment to our human rights, our right to exist. And I think that is what's going to fundamentally drive it. And the sooner we recognise that, the better, because we don't want to actually repeat the mistakes of the 1930s.
Yeah, I mean, I think the changing nature of work is one of the big challenges that we face. I think, though, that, I mean, it's something which we've known about for a very long time. I mean, if you think about James Mead writing in the 1960s about this, or if you think about some of the science fiction that was produced, Kurt Vonnegut's book Player Piano in the 1950s, I mean, this has been present in the culture for a long time, but what we are now seeing is that some of these trends are coming much closer to being real, and I think that it one of the problems we face is that we've got to think about how we reorganize our societies, but recognizing that we've got a political culture which often stands in the way of doing this, so that there is still huge political obstacles to actually thinking about unconditional payments to people, so that and it may be that we have to proceed more cautiously in terms of Tony Atkinson, for instance, has written he's sympathetic to the idea of basic income, but he argues that it would be better to think initially in terms of a participation income in order to make, in order to go with the grain of the present political culture. In order to gradually build up support, we have to find ways of building coalitions of support. We can be clear about the direction of travel, and I think thinking about some of these big global challenges must inform that. But at the same time, we've got to also think about some of the political practicalities of how actually we gradually persuade people more. I mean, we've got to do this by consent. We can't, no one, I think, no one in this room anyway, wants to impose things by force. And that means we've got to. You only have to look at the tabloid press to see the journey we've got to make.
I just want to, I think I'm really intrigued by this idea that you know, in this automated world, there's going to be lots of people without jobs, so basic income could be a way to give some, to solve that problem, or to give people some share in this, because it to me, that vision is a dystopia, really, not a utopia at all. The idea that we've got these companies becoming rich, or we've got some very high-skilled, high-tech workers in California or wherever they are, making lots of money, it's okay because then we're going to give a whole lot of people £71 a week in order to do nothing or something. So well, it may not have to be 71, but then we're back to all our things about the choices. Well, I'd rather, shouldn't we be, I think this is a really major issue. I absolutely agree, the changing nature of work, but I just think that that's not the answer. That's not an answer that creates a society that sounds like, well, like I say, it seems like a dystopia. I'd rather use that. Could we not use that money to create jobs for people? I think people actually want jobs, good quality jobs.
Sorry, what was that?
Somebody wants to respond.
I think we have to start by getting away from the idea that the only thing that's useful is people going out to work and earning money. And the last comment that you make, Kitty, about, giving people money to do nothing. I've spent a lot of time not doing nothing, but I haven't been waged. I've brought up children, I've home educated, I've been active in my local community, I've done lots of volunteering, I've educated myself, I've been interested in art and things of that sort. I've seen people in this city who are working 3 jobs. Their husbands are working 3 jobs. They never get to see their children. I've seen young people with horrendous mental health problems. I've seen people who are victims of a benefit system. So, whilst I understand there are problems with this, what I would say to you is, if all you can bring me problems with this, you have to bring me some solutions to how things are now, because it doesn't work. And I can't bear walking through Sheffield, seeing more and more people living on our streets. It's not acceptable.
I think there's certainly something that's come up a few times in this discussion, actually, about defining what work actually is, and that what we call work in terms of something that gives you a wage and is sitting at a desk is not necessarily what should be the total definition of work. So maybe that's something that should be explored as well.
Just in terms of, so my son is 14 years old, he's a wheelchair user. We've been on a low enough income to claim carer's allowance, which is about £200 a month. Do the maths, 7 4s are 28, £280 a month would be a hell of a lot better than £200 a month. But that's very important work, but it's not paid. And that's one of the things that the basic income would perhaps, acknowledge. But I think you've hit a really important point, which is when I look at our education system, and particularly as the father of a disabled child, it's an education system which is based on a culture of testing and league tables, geared towards creating economic units to compete in a global marketplace. It's contributing to mental health problems. It is destroying a lot of children. It is constraining them. They are not allowed to flourish. And this is a purely economic model geared up to exactly the world you describe, a world of work. And if you haven't got economic productivity measured in terms of a wage and what you're contributing to an economy in a tangible way, you are devalued and discarded and effectively becoming increasingly excluded. And I think this is a crucial thing. And what we touched on, the cultural change. That a basic income would bring. It is that cultural change which say, it is very, very important to be a father or a mother or a carer. It is very, very important to be an artist. It's very, very important to be a poet. And, I play in a band. I've been playing in a band for 20 years, and we play all around the UK and a bit over in France. And every time I go over to France, they absolutely celebrate the arts and music over there. They really value it. We go over there, we get treated, almost like royalty. We get meals and we get a chaperone and we get put up in a hotel. And they, and you get nothing like that in this country. But they actually invest in the arts and they value the arts. And starting in our schools, it's very narrow focus on the sciences and maths and literacy. And our children are not flourishing. You know, those children that are, we could have some Rembrandts, we could have some amazing poets there, but they're not going to be encouraged to flourish and pursue that because it's devalued. And it is about a different set of values, a different way of looking at the world. But it's also about saying, you know what, we are richer than we've ever been. There is enough money. The problem is the political will to put it in the right hands and to actually create the kind of society that we want to have and to say to ourselves, we can be so much better than this.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to. I can see it sounded. I didn't mean to imply that the only work that I think is important is paid work, and certainly I completely agree that I think the extent to which people have to. Some people are struggling on many jobs right now, and the extent to which we don't value carers has to be addressed. But it's just this idea. I mean, I know I keep coming back to £71 a week, but I think we need to be realistic about what this is going to look like, because otherwise I'm all signed up. You know, if there's absolutely no limits to the amount of money we can spend, and I'd like to see the Green Party's costings on this and how they're also going to fund other things, then of course I agree the principle's a wonderful thing, but if it's £71 a week, it's not sufficient for people to live. I mean, we know that for job seekers allowance, it's not enough for people to live on. It's not enough. And I think we can value the arts by spending money on the arts and by being prepared to pay tax in order to fund theatre, and we can do much more about redistribution around the country and supporting jobs, all types of jobs, doing all the kinds of things people want to do, gardening and the arts, and we can do more to support carers. We can have much more generous carers allowances, but. If you, the problem with the basic income, because it's universal and it's going to everybody, it is very, very expensive. So in order to support the communities that really need to be supported, it's huge, and to reach and to support families to the extent that they need to be supported and make sure they don't live in poverty any more than they do today, and preferably a lot less than they do today. It's hugely expensive to do that, and that means you won't have the resources to put into all sorts of other things like public services, which we all need and rely on. So I think this is I'm sorry to be sitting here being the really misery gut, saying it's not going to work, you know, but I do think that. It's lovely to talk about the principle, but I do think we have to talk about the detail. And when you look about the detail, there's a real problem here about doing this and doing all the other things I know that people in the room would like to do too.
Well, the devil is in the detail, as they say. And certainly there's a question that I think John and I spoke about earlier that we'd like to come to at some point this evening, which is if you give £71 a week to everybody, what about all of those people who are already earning in the higher tax bracket and perhaps don't really need it? But this lovely gentleman in the middle who's been extremely patient, can we get the microphone over to him, please? Thank you.
Okay, is that it? Okay, I'm going to join the misery guts. Misery guts, but not quite. I like numbers, and we do need to look at the numbers, but I'm getting old and I can't do the mental maths anymore. So I want to have a quite simple framework here. My assumption is that the basic wage is a redistribution of income. That's it. From what I can work out, the mean income, the average mean, not the median at the moment, is about 13,500, 14,000 per everybody in the population, children, everybody. That's what I've tried to work it two ways, and that's what I get to. Therefore, it's not possible for that's the absolute upper limit of a basic income. If everybody got 13,500, all work would be taxed at 100%, and that was the end of the story. That is the absolute ceiling. If you want to say everybody should have perhaps 50%, if you want the citizens' wage to be 50% of the mean, not median, then clearly you're going to need to have 50% tax, because I like these simple numbers. You're going to need 50% tax on all the money you earn in order to pay for that 50%. And so on. If you want your citizens' wage to be 60% of the mean, which is actually above poverty because the median is done by poverty, if you want it to be 60% of the mean, you must charge 60% of income tax if you want it to be if you want it to come from income. So that's a much simpler framework. I can't stand all these billions taken from here, there, and stick on some other pot. It makes no sense. So that's my simple picture. And instead, if you want to take the current situation, you need 8%. I've worked out you need 8% of current income for the kind of things that income tax goes for that are not decisions of wage, namely the disability, the benefits, and there's a certain amount goes to NHS and that. So whatever figure you come up with, you need to add 8% to it to cover the current things. Now that's much simpler, and it puts some kind of ceiling on what's possible. Clearly, so if it's say 14,000 for everybody at the moment, so 50% would be 7,000, and roughly that's 140 a week, I think. So you could get 140 a week for everybody. If you give more to pensioners, you must give less to children, or the other way around, because I know you've got different levels. So that gives you a much simpler framework. Is it a much simpler framework to think about it in? Okay. Sorry, it's boring.
First thing to say is that there are lots of different models that have been pursued. Okay, people are doing models in this country, they're doing models abroad. It's coming, the modelling is getting more sophisticated. As I understand you, you're saying this all has to be, whatever we take from incomes only, that gets channeled back into a basic income, but that's not the way the welfare state works. It's not, we get tax, there's corporation tax, there's all sorts of tax. Yeah.
At the moment, all the benefits do come from income tax. They do at the moment. If you look at the ONS sheets.
Well, there might be an equivalent, but it's not like the inland revenue we've heard. The inland revenue is separate from the Department of Work and Pensions, and it all goes into a pot, called public expenditure. And the amount that we take in all the different taxes, income tax and all the other taxes, is 43% of gross domestic product in Germany, 36% in the UK. That's public expenditure. The 70 kind of £2 figure that we've been chucking around comes from the model where we would amalgamate the existing welfare state and the personal tax allowances and stick them all in a pot and work with that existing budget, so there's no more progressive taxation. That's the kind of model that we were talking about here. If we take a more progressive tax, using the wealth tax and all the other taxes, and were to bring our spending up to a level like Germany, then you can increase the basic income up to a certain level and put your spending into the NHS, depending on how much more you want to take in terms of tax. So, I don't think anyone's suggesting that it is simply a matter of a correlation between income tax and redistribution into basic income. It's much, much, much more complicated than that, involving other taxes, other income sources, pensions, for example. So I take your point about the medium income, but that's not the kind of model. I'm not aware anyone's working to that exact model. Maybe Kitty is. I don't know whether you know anyone that's working to that. No, I don't mean you are. Is anyone that you know of working to that kind of model?
The £140.
The just income tax being the basis of...
No, I don't think so, no. I think it is, because it's all one pot, so it may be roughly the same, but it is all one pot, essentially.
Well, I just want to make the point that I think your figure's about right for, if you took, I think it's maybe a bit higher than the figure you're saying, but let's say 16, 17,000. If you take GDP and divide it by the population, you end up with a figure like that, don't you? So, well, GDP is all the incomes going through. GDP is about £1 trillion divided by 60. Well, okay, so anyway, I'm kind of agreeing with you anyway, so we get there by different, I don't know how we got the same figure from different routes, but we end up with the same figure. And the point I want to make is that the poorest 10% are on £4,000 a year. So if 16,000 is your mean and 4,000 is your current reality, Plato's ideal distribution was 1 to 5. We're currently 1 to 13 at least. Although the chief executive of the NHS is currently earning 50 times the income of the poorest 10%. So it seems to me there's quite a lot of slack, if you're working around that mean, to redistribute, to have some inequality, if you really want it, and yet to have people on the lowest incomes be either at that level that they are now, but guaranteed, and strip away all the marginal tax rates, which would then be an improvement. So even on the current income, basic income for the poorest would be an improvement, or to lift it. So it seems to me that's okay. I think the other point I want to make about a lot of this, Kitty's talking about, everybody always wants to spend money on the NHS, so throw rotten tomatoes at me for saying, why all the time? I mean, I have friends in Doncaster who have basically, through peer support and supporting each other, people in poverty are doing what the NHS does for nothing. They've saved, like the NHS, £250,000 a year by offering each other peer support. Again, if you start rethinking the way we operate and support each other, we don't have to keep thinking of everything in the same traditional way. There are lots of ways of being healthier and taking care of each other that would look different in the case of a basic income. Everything doesn't stay the same. I think that's the fundamental thing. People won't just be running out and doing poetry, much as I love poetry. They'll also be doing all sorts of other interesting things and taking care of each other. On the way here tonight, I dropped in at the hand-picked bookstore on the road opposite the town hall, and I was saying to the lady, who it turned out we knew, I know her husband is a fellow of the Centre for Welfare Reform, so we were talking about this. I said, I'm off to talk about basic income. She said, I don't know much about that, but I could really do with that because it would cover the rent in this little business she owns, which is very hard to make money in doing something really interesting that brings real value. If any of you have not dropped in there, go round to Handpicked Books. It's a great bookstore. But this existing on a tiny margin, what she needs a bit of security in her income so that she could then do productive, value-adding activity in our community.
Any more questions? I saw the lady behind you first, I'm afraid.
I've got, oh, no, it's way too loud.
It's working very well.
I've got two questions. One is my own at first, which is, we've been talking so far about, in terms of the fact that we have got this money available, but it's all about the sort of political persuasion and political ideas, which are the way you redistribute it. How would that be affected by the current system we have, in the sense of each government takes 4-year terms? And would the system of basic income change dramatically between each party's control, etc., etc.? And what problems would that throw up? The second question is actually my mum's. I'm asking on behalf of her because she's not here. She asked, would there be freeloaders? What are the problems of freeloaders? How do you tackle freeloaders? And all of the issues which come with that, in the sense of they still might exist in the system of basic income, even if they're not being sort of penalised and means tested.
Who wants to go first?
Yes, I think those two questions go to the heart of some very big problems. I mean, I think the first one, how do you stop a government coming in and reversing what its predecessor has done? I think the best example there is the National Health Service. You have to have a level of political support for a basic change, which then makes it very difficult for any incoming government to overturn it. You have to have a basic consensus across the political parties. You have an example of we're going to have a test of this in the United States with Donald Trump as to how far he feels able to repeal Obamacare when 20 million Americans are now dependent upon it. And already he seems to be rowing back from that commitment. But we'll see the Republican Congress may well want to pursue a policy of repeal. But it is exactly that problem that unless you actually can build up a very strong political consensus around whether it's the National Health Service, basic income, or any other aspect of the welfare state, it is always then vulnerable to being to having adversary politics and for it to be repealed as when you move from one government to another. And on the other question, just very quickly, I mean, I'd say that one of the one of the fears that is always expressed is the problem of freeloading, and the libertarian argument has always been, why should we care how people spend their life? People want to stay in bed all day. That we might think that's a waste, but why should we worry? I think that whilst I have that part of me has sympathy with that libertarian argument, I can see that politically it's a very difficult argument to win. That most people think that people, if they're receiving an income from the community, they should put something back into the community. Now, that doesn't have to be waged work or anything of that kind. It can be in other ways, but that's this idea of a participation income, that actually in return for the grant of basic income, everybody has an obligation to do useful things for the community, and there's a whole range of possibilities. And I think, I think the political practicality of building support for basic income, that's the direction of travel we ought to think about.
The problem with that, though, is that you move away. I mean, the beauty of basic income is that there's no conditions. Everybody gets it. You don't have to explain yourself or apply for it. So, I agree that I think a participation version would be politically more acceptable and would win more hearts. But then you've immediately got to introduce a system of people have to explain what they're doing and persuade you that they are doing something valuable, and it's really important that they do this particular piece of work.
Well, I think one of the earliest real-world examples of basic income was in ancient Athens, where they created a citizen's income, which was on the basis that people needed to be free to participate in the politics of the society. And I suspect, I mean, that's why, in a sense, I'm not very keen on treating basic income as this beautiful, polished policy that we just give to politicians and ask them to implement. I mean, Jonathan's our ideal politician in this context, but even Jonathan is just a politician in that sense, is subject to all sorts of pressures, and he's the very nice bit of the elite, but this is the elite we've allowed to rule our lives. And what the Athenians were objecting to and where democracy came from was people saying, we don't want that. We want to be in control of our own lives. And actually the Athenians didn't just make democratic decisions about government, they actually ran the government. They were the civil service, and they had a whole series of civic duties. So I think the participation version of basic income is a bit of a confusion for the reasons Kitty's touched on. I mean, who's going to oversee it? And I don't think that's the answer. But I think it's quite reasonable to imagine creating a system of basic income on one hand and a much clearer sense of civic duty on the other hand. Just start saying, this is the sort of stuff we need to do. And now we've got a bit more time and we're freed from that. We can do this really useful stuff. I mean, Athens didn't do badly with a genuinely democratic society run by its own citizens, did it? It created the greatest art, philosophy, theatre. So I think as a model to go for, I think ancient Athens might teach us something. And I know that people say women, and then they'll also say slavery. But, this level of slavery in Athens was relatively low. There were tens of thousands of citizens, and they had a basic system of basic income. So I think in a funny way we need to embrace these questions and look at duty and responsibility in a much more positive light. I don't think we should go down the libertarian route at all, because that, in a sense, who's going to be supporting the basic income? It's got to be the demos. That's where these original models came from. It didn't come from the elite saying, I know, let's take care of the slaves. It was the demos who actually threatened the elite and demanded power. And I think that unless we see basic income in a kind of genuinely political way as something that we can build a movement around, it will just become another idea like the living wage that the powerful will take over and then corrupt. So, that's my fear, really, that basic income actually, in the end, can just be a word that you can apply to almost anything, and then we lose what we're really trying to achieve. I just want to make a point about freeloaders. I would think one man's freeloader is another person's banker, isn't it, really? You've got to be very careful about who's making the judgments here. Yeah.
I suspect Jonathan's going to want to weigh in a second, particularly on the short-termism in politics. But just while we're in this part of the discussion, it might be worth bringing up, alongside participation, basic income, and so on, and rights and duties, is there a human rights angle to this? Actually, if we accept that if you're a human being, you have the right to safety, shelter, warmth, clean water, clothing, food, and unfortunately we live in a society where you require money to exchange for those things under a system of global capitalism. Is that perhaps a reason to look at this when we're on that topic anyway? But over to you, Jonathan.
As a member of the elite, I think that rights point is spot on. I think we need to move out of, I'm trying to modify my language, but when I'm talking about what this government is doing to the disabled particularly, I often refer to the vulnerable, and I think we need to move away from that language and talk about people who have dignity and have rights, and do put it in a rights-based context. And this, for me, is the point. We have all this wealth, and we have a right to be partaking in this wealth, and we're not getting it, and it is wrong. And ultimately, rights come down to what is right and what isn't, and this should be a human right. It really should. But politically, we've got a problem here, because I'll be absolutely honest about what I think about the political situation now, with the Tories pushing through the boundary changes, with Jeremy Corbyn at the head of the Labour Party. I think we're looking at decades of Conservative government in this country. And I think on the left, and I class myself as on the left, we have to look very, very seriously at this. The Conservatives aren't going to bring in the basic income. John McDonnell is starting to look at it. He's making the right noises about it. The Greens have been signed up to it for 20 years. But if we want to see this introduced, if we're going to get there, we need some kind of progressive government in place. I do not believe that Labour can win the next election on their own. They need to work with other parties on the left, and the left needs to get its act together. And the left is very good about saying what it's against, but it's not great at articulating the vision about what it wants to see in society. And I touched on it earlier, but I think the key to this is electoral reform. Because at the moment, it is those few 100,000 voters in swing seats that determine the outcome of elections, that determine the manifestos, the way the messaging is targeted. And until we get a progressive government that introduces electoral reform, we won't see these kinds of issues like basic income on the political agenda. There are 10 million disabled people in this country. 10 million. That is a huge power base. But they do not determine the outcomes of elections. There are millions of people in this country really concerned about climate change. They don't, and Trident, and they don't determine the outcomes of elections. And these are the biggest crises facing us as a country, as a world. What determines the outcomes of elections is the tax and spend messages that are pitched at those few 100,000 voters in Middle England, not in Sheffield, in Middle England. And if the people of Sheffield want a voice, we're going to have to get electoral reform. And I think that needs to be, so we're just talking political strategy here. We need a progressive alliance. We need to look at a progressive alliance where we are standing together to put forward the strongest candidate in seats, where we can defeat 50 or 60 Tory MPs, which would be enough in order to form a progressive government which would introduce electoral reform, and that is the game changer. If you change the voting system, you change people's lives. It's as simple as that. And then we get basic income on the agenda. I cannot see another way that we're going to get it in the next few decades in the UK. So in a sense, this whole discussion becomes very, very hypothetical about numbers. But actually, I'm desperate to see change in people's lives, and I do believe that's the key to unlocking this.
Great. Any more? Yeah. You were just pipped to the post last time. Go for it.
Thank you. One of the things that struck me when you were talking is when you were talking about duty and about what people should, participatory citizens' income or basic income, was that my background's in behaviourism, and that if you want someone to do something, you reinforce the behaviour you want. You don't try and punish them. And I think what we can see at the minute is very punitive government that's trying to punish people into work, and it doesn't work. And if we look at the evidence we have from the spirit level, we can see that when you change the economics of inequality, you change the social aspects of society. And no one's talked about the idea that, and we've talked very much about the economics in terms of if we add up all of these benefits and we take all of this tax take, then it adds up to this. We're not talking about what, I don't have a better word for it, but maybe externalities. So things like the NHS won't have to spend as much money, particularly mental health, but I think physical health as well, if we have a society that's more equal. If we have a society that people have more time for caring, if we have a society for people to spend more time thinking about the food they eat, the exercise they do, the work they want to do, if they have more choices in their lives. I'm happy to call myself a libertarian, a left libertarian, and I do think that giving people empowerment to look after their own lives, which is what a basic income would do, would allow the state to spend a lot less money on dealing with the problems of society. No one's mentioned crime. You know, the £4,000 a year, we know people can't live on £4,000 a year. And so a lot of people are forced into doing things that are illegal. And I'm not necessarily talking about major organised crime, but crime on the fringes of society, which costs the society money. Things like insurance fraud, things like, not going through the taxation system. And this is all money which is not figured into the figures for things like a citizen's income. If people have enough money to live a dignified life, they don't have to turn to those things, which then means that there's more money in the real economy rather than the black economy. And I think that that's something that's not included in a lot of the analysis that I think could be really, really useful.
Well, I'd certainly agree with that. I mean, and remember in the spirit level, it talked about Japan, didn't it, with the highest level of equality, income equality, and very low levels of public spending because there was not the same need, because the core economy of human beings taking care of each other and the other advantages of equality actually reduced the demand for those kind of services. And that is the irony. We worship at the altar of public services sometimes and forget that the basic thing that public services are addressing is our needs in our communities. And obviously, the less we can do because we're exhausted from working all these jobs, and then the more we demand of those services. But it's a vicious cycle that isn't at all helpful. One of the statistics, again, that intrigues me is if you look at public spending over the last few decades, it's been broadly at roughly the same level until very recently starting to fall. In that period, what is significantly changed but is never talked about is that spending on services has grown significantly. Spending on addressing poverty has dropped. It seems to grow because the overall benefit bill seems high, but actually almost all of that is paid directly back in taxes. The real net impact of benefits is just over 20 billion a year, which is a tiny portion of the whole thing. And the impact of benefits over the last 30 years in terms of addressing poverty has fallen by 50%. So we've got this system that is, and that makes sense, doesn't it? Politicians get brownie points for spending money on the NHS, and they get brownie points for cutting benefits for people on low income. So it's not surprising that we're going in the direction we're going. And I think that what critics of basic income have to at least find, if they are for social justice and are critical of basic income, then we need some way of reimagining the politics that takes us in the direction of social justice that's different, not just advising politicians on technical changes, but actually a whole vision of society that starts to address this problem.
Thank you. Just to jump in, Jonathan has to leave us in a couple of minutes' time. So before we move on to Kitty, I'll just, if you've got anything to say on that, and a goodbye before you have to go and get your train.
Goodbye, I have to get my train. No, thank you, I've really enjoyed it. I just think this is a really critical moment in in British history, in the world's history, there seems to be a rejection of the old ways of doing things, and this is a moment of opportunity, and we've got authoritarian fascists moving in to take over, people who are calling for the removal of high court judges because they don't like the decisions, people that are moving in the States in a very authoritarian way, and those who consider themselves to be progressive need to get their act together and move into that vacuum before it is taken over. Because this is a moment of change. If we were sitting here 2 years ago, no one would have predicted the situation that we're in today with Corbyn leading the Labour Party, the EU referendum, Trump in America. This is seismic, and we need to recognise the magnitude of what is going on right now. We need to listen to the people that voted Leave. We need to listen to why people voted for Donald Trump. They are right to be angry. They are absolutely right to be angry, and we've got to engage with them. And those progressives, we must engage with them. And we have to understand, and we have to listen, and we need to act, and we need to present that vision. This is why the basic income is so important, because it is part of that vision of what we can be. We can be so much better than this. I'm so sorry to have to go, but it's the only way I'm going to get back to London before bedtime. Thank you.
Yeah, massive thanks from all of us at Festival Debate to Jonathan for coming along. And before we introduced his wonderful replacement on the panel, I'm going to hand you back over to Kitty, because I know you wanted to get in on that last question.
Yeah, I just wanted to get on, because I think we need to be really careful here, because the effects of a basic income on inequality are actually really quite small, quite limited. So we need to not get too overexcited that this is the... I'm all for, I've read the SPERI level. I think inequality is responsible for a lot of evils, but I think that because you're spreading this money out, remember, we're spreading the money out, it's universal, every single person in the country gets it. That means it's going to be lower than if it goes more to the households that are in need. And I think there are other things we could do that would have a much bigger effect on inequality. More generous child benefits, because households with children where needs are greater than income that can come into the households. If we target on households with children, on disabled households with a disabled adult or a disabled child, we could make those benefits much more generous. We could have employment and support allowance. Now it's only 6 months for contributory employment and support allowance instead of it used to be a year. That's really hit, although that's supposedly a universal benefit, that's really hit low-income households, because households with a disabled person tend to be right at the bottom of the distribution. So without an income test, you can do things without an income test that reach the households that are most in need. And if you're not doing it universally, you can make the amount of support that you're giving them much more generous. So I think because it sounds like such a lovely idea, I think we just need to be a bit wary about thinking that this is going to solve inequality. It actually ends up having quite small effects on inequality. And in response to Simon, I don't know I don't know quite where your figures come from, but it's the social security system with all its flaws, and certainly it's doing much less redistributing now under recent cuts. But it makes a very big difference. I think it reduces the extent of child poverty pre and after tax and benefits by 70% or something. It does have a very, very big effect. And the child tax credit system, when it was at its strongest in 2009-10, protected children from the effects of the recession to quite a significant degree. Child poverty fell in absolute, not just in relative terms, during those last few years of the Labour government. So it's not perfect. But it's doing a very important role. And I think if you look at any version of universal basic income which says we're going to scrap child tax credits, I think you just want to be wary. That is some very, very needy households in this country that you'd be hitting, and you just want to be sure that you're seeing the projections about what will happen to child poverty and what will happen to inequality.
Thank you. Before we take another question, I would like to introduce Laura Bannister. If you give her a bit of a round of applause, get her up on the stage. Laura is the Director of World Basic Income and a Green Party member, so the political balance of the panel has not changed. Everybody else had a few minutes, obviously, at the start to describe their position on basic income, so I'd like to offer Laura the same chance now, and then we'll go back to questions from the floor.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I've always been very passionate about basic income ever since I first heard about it. I've also always been very aware that the problems of poverty and inequality that we're trying to solve with basic income in the UK are kind of just go to a much more enormous scale once you look worldwide. And so after many years of thinking about basic income on the national level, I realised that we also need to be looking at that on an international level, and started looking into it and decided and became absolutely committed that what we really, really need is a worldwide basic income as well as national basic incomes in every country. So I've recently set up an organisation, along with Paul, who is an economist who works worldwide in development, to campaign for a world basic income. It's a bit of a big idea. It seems complete pie in the sky right now, I know, because it's brand new, but so did basic income when I first heard about it 6 years ago. We would never have had events like this. So I've brought with me a human PowerPoint demonstration, which I'm going to ask the panel, because otherwise you're going to be stuck behind it, to assist me with, just to very briefly explain what on earth I'm on about. So starting with, if you wouldn't mind, you'll need to stand up at the front of the stage. Thank you. And while I'm talking, I'd like to just pass around this sign-up sheet. Paul, could you grab that for me? If anybody wants to find out a bit more about us, because we are so very brand new, please stick your name on here and I can add you to my list. Okay, so yeah, go on, stand up at the front. And if you let it go like this, I bought some of these clever tags, so you might need to stand back on the stage. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so what is a world basic income? It is a global scheme which would gather up money at the global level. So there's an awful lot of wealth worldwide that never really touches down in national economies anymore. That is a growing trend. And we need to start harnessing that if we're really going to get a handle on world inequality. And the worldwide scheme redistributes it to every person worldwide every month or every week or however you want to do it. It's important to pick a figure. We're suggesting starting with $10, $10 US per person per month, every month. That seems like a very low figure, and we're not suggesting it as a replacement for basic income in countries that can afford basic incomes that are much more substantial than that. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about what $10 can do. This amount is just a starting figure. The idea is that once this is a worldwide scheme, you get the funding mechanisms going, we can increase it to whatever we want. You know, this is essentially our scheme that we run as a human population for our human rights, and we can increase it to whatever level we can manage to increase it to. Just as a note, cash is already being given out to people all over the world through social security, including in poor countries. South Africa, for instance, has amazing child benefit and social pension schemes. So does Namibia. So do lots and lots of other countries. Brazil has a huge cash transfer program. The World Food Programme gives about 25% of its aid in cash already. So this is not a fabulously new thing. What's new about a world basic income is bringing these ideas together and making it a universal comprehensive scheme. That's what it is. Thank you very much. Okay, which one should we do next? Next one. Okay, would you grab that for me? What would $10 do, if you're wondering? There's actually a second part to this, so if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. So if you're wondering, I've done quite a lot of research into incomes around the world, oh dear, because I think sometimes people think that, you know, oh, a dollar counts for a lot in another country, prices are very low. It's actually shocking how little people do live on. So $10, when it says $10, it means $10. It means what you could buy with $10 in the USA. It doesn't mean kind of $10 US spent in a very poor country with low prices. These are some of the, these are some real families that gathered up by an organisation called Dollar Street. They take photos and meet families and discuss their incomes. So this family from Colombia, $10 a month would be an 8.1% rise in their income. This family in Zimbabwe, a 29% rise. In Indonesia, an 8.7% rise. Got 22%, 25%, 34%, and so on. Even in a rich country, I mean, you know, at the moment, many of you may be thinking $10 is not very much. I'm living on one of the kind of incomes that you've been talking about at the moment. I wouldn't say no to $10 a month. And I know that, for instance, a single parent with 4 children getting $50, kind of £35 extra a month, wouldn't be saying no to that either. So it's not completely irrelevant here to everybody. And it's certainly something that, you know, we will be looking to increase over time. Anyway, so that's your $10. Here's the big question. So who else would you like to join the human PowerPoint? Yeah, well, this one's going to have to probably fall down by the stage. We've talked a lot tonight about funding, how you fund it, because, of course, you can't run anything unless you can fund it. So a world basic income at $10 per person per month works out at $75 billion per month, needed. That's $900 billion a year, so 0.9 trillion. That's about 1.2% of world GNI. So, around a 90th of the total world income every year. That's not a very large amount. When we're not talking about taking things away, we're talking about just diverting it from this stream into a stream that goes to everybody in the world who then spend it back into the economy. Here's some ways that we could gather that. So, I've done some basic numbers. These are based on kind of reasonable tax rates that have been proposed for these things by, so for instance, financial transaction tax. We're talking about amounts that have been proposed by like the OECD and other big organisations. The common corporate shares, that was proposed by Varoufakis the other day. The carbon tax is the rate proposed by the IMF. So these aren't kind of my inventions of how much you could raise. So to cover how much we need each, there's 12 months in a year. You could raise about 2 months of it through a financial transaction tax, as currently proposed. 3 months through common corporate shares. That's where every time a new company is started up, it's a percentage of the shares go into like a common fund, and the dividends go to the common fund and get redistributed. Charging for intellectual property protection. Charging for aviation and shipping, planes flying through. Who owns the air? I think we all own the air, and I think it's reasonable to charge for that. Wealth taxes, these have been proposed by Piketty, and again at very, very reasonable rates. It requires some more financial transparency, but that's a challenge we have to tackle anyway. The real biggie is carbon tax, which surprised me when I did these numbers. Carbon tax could, at the rate proposed by the IMF, could provide 26.5 months of world basic income every year. So you will notice that if you add these all together, you get about 3 years' worth of basic income every year. So if you manage to harvest all of these funding sources, you could actually fund a $30 a month world basic income for everybody in the entire world, which would absolutely blast income poverty out of the water and kind of end it straight away. So we don't even need to succeed in all of these areas. So that is, that's how we would fund it. And very last, we could just cover this very quickly. Thank you very much. How would you give it out? Basically, what we envisage, it's not up to me and Paul in the end of the day, it's up to everybody in the world, and we can have whatever scheme we want, but what we envisage is that it would be a scheme with direct transfers, not via national governments, although we would have to cooperate with them. It would get transferred directly from the international global scheme into people's bank accounts. People that don't have a bank account, you can transfer it direct to their mobile phones. In Africa, this is an African tech invention. Tons of people, I think already around 12% of the population are using mobile phone banking based on those very old kind of Nokia style phones. It's just like a text, just like send text, just send money, receive money, check balance, all on your mobile phone. There's other options for that as well. You can do charge cards, you can do giving it to agents with ID codes. There's lots and lots of ways of doing it. The important thing to know is we've got the technology. There is the funding out there. We could have a world basic income straight away. Again, it's a matter of political will. We've set up this organisation to campaign for it, to try and develop that political will. So we'll be really pleased to have your support and get you talking about it and sharing things online and helping to build up some momentum towards this. Please do sign up if you are interested in finding out more. And I have some business cards as well, if you would like our web address, which is worldbasicincome.org.uk. Thank you very much.
Well, I think the prize for most innovative 5-minute introduction goes to. But we are starting to run out of time, so I'm going to go straight back to questions from the floor. We want to get as many of those in as possible. Man at the back had his hand up first. Well done, man at the back.
Is it working? Yeah. Oh, good. I always sort of support the idea of universal basic income, but without really knowing too much about it. And I'm not really that clued up on economics either. But the first thing people always say to me when I say, this is an idea that I like, is what would that do to inflation and prices? And can you actually prevent prices rising of like basic commodities like food and things that people need? If everyone's richer, will companies not just raise the prices? The other thing, what other effects could it have on an economy? I don't know. That's what I'd like, to know. And then coming back to something that was mentioned earlier, what effect would it actually have on reducing the gap between the richest and poorest? Because it's not just about raising the lowest level of income, but actually a lot of problems are caused by the size of the gap between the top and the bottom. And that, you know, would it be better? Would it not? You know, might it make more sense to reduce tax on the poorest people and increase tax on the richest people, which would actually, you know, bring that gap down? So hopefully that was, I think it was like 3 questions, but hopefully that made sense.
On inflation, I once studied the introduction of the minimum wage in the UK, and there was a lot of controversy in advance of that all it would do would be to raise inflation, and the gains that people on low wages would get from having a better minimum wage would be completely wiped out by an increase in prices. That argument's been made in pretty much every country with every single initiative that ever to bring up the incomes of the poorest people. It doesn't usually happen to any significant degree, certainly not sufficient to wipe out the gains from raising the incomes in the first place. I think the experiments with basic income, there's been pilot experiments in Namibia, in India, in lots of other countries. The experience tends to be that there can be some changes in prices in the short term in closed markets. So, for instance, I think in one experiment where cash transfers were given, people there, as a security measure, tended to put, if they had savings, they tended to spend them on buying cattle. There was a very closed market for cattle. They all bought them locally, so the price of cattle did skyrocket. But as soon as, they had access to cattle markets from elsewhere, and as soon as those benefits became more long-term and they didn't feel the need to put them into something that they felt was an absolutely safe asset, then, the price tended to regulate out again. So it's not something you can completely control. The other thing to mention is that basic income, we're not talking about creating more money. Price inflation tends to happen when you're actually putting in more money for the same amount of stuff in the economy. What we're talking about generally is redistributing money from the upper end towards the lower end. So what it should mean is that, the well-off spend a bit less so that the rest of us can spend a bit more. So it shouldn't overall have a significant effect on inflation. Hopefully not something that would wipe out the benefits. I certainly don't think so.
Well, yeah, there were a lot of questions there, weren't there? I thought this is a bit tangential, but I think one of the most interesting economic effects of basic income could be to allow us to abandon the way in which we currently generate money. So money is just created by the state. In the post-war years, to create demand, a lot of that was driven by public spending. From the 1970s onwards, we've seen governments across the Western world stop doing that and to enable banks to print money. The problem we've found is that actually banks only lend it to the rich, so the money supply is now artificially distorted to the rich. So we see inflation all over the place at the moment, but often the government excludes it from the figures, but house price inflation is the huge kind of whale of a problem in our economy, which actually created the banking crisis, because who are the banks lending to? Middle class people with houses, and all of this is underpinned by government policy. So we've lived through a kind of massive inflation problem, but a different one to the one we were living through in the 1970s, and one we don't want to talk about because the people control the media are the people who've benefited from this incredible asset inflation that they've gone through. So I think what you'll see here is, I suppose I call it democratic Keynesianism. Yeah, so Keynesianism is basically the idea that the state fundamentally does need to pay attention to how much money is printed. It needs to avoid inflation, but it also needs to avoid undersupply of money into the system. And it's instead of saying, let's do this through the banks, because aren't they wonderful, trustworthy and clever institutions? It's saying, let's do this through people, our people, our citizens. And that's, in a sense, instead of this debate about taxation, actually that's another way of looking at what's going on. It's a choice about how money gets generated in the economy. And that's how actually a government will start this. They'll say, well, we'll just put this money in your account. We will then try and, for all sorts of good reasons, try and increase the taxes on the rich. And the willingness of the rich to accept those taxes, in theory, will go up because they will still benefit from this extra income. And again, it's worth saying that one of the key ingredients of basic income, which everybody would benefit from, is not the money, but the security of knowing that you'll get the money. That it's that lack of conditionality that's very, very important and is a missing in the current system. So I think there are good economic reasons for going in this direction, although clearly this is an issue that's very much debated, and you know, I suppose I'm acting from faith around some of this stuff. Nobody's really tried this yet, but it is what the positive money people and those kind of people talking about how money gets invented and how it gets distributed have been drawing our attention to for the last few years.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to note that basic income isn't a panacea. I mean, it can't stand on its own. So that you have to have other forms of regulation of labour markets, of the money supply, of housing markets, and so on. If you just relied on basic income, I think you'd have a very unregulated system, and one which could be very unstable. So it seems to me that you need a whole panoply of policies, of which basic income could be a part, but it's not. You know, we shouldn't. I think it would be a big mistake to think that we can achieve all the objectives we want just with basic income. And I think so many of the problems that we have, so a problem like inflation, I mean, that can be dealt with, but it's a different set of instruments that have to be there. And so you have, I think, that any realistic political economy has to have a whole number of elements, and basic income could be part of the way we want to move towards a different kind of society, a fairer society, one with greater social justice. But it would be wrong to put, I think, too much emphasis upon it as a solution to all our problems.
Yeah, I think the inequality reducing effects would come from the progressive elements of taxation rather than... so you remember, again, many people at the bottom won't be gaining from the basic income. If you're on job seekers allowance, employment and support allowance, child tax credits, you'll already be... you're not going to be getting any more from any of the systems that I've seen, and you may well be getting less. So... that's why the power to reduce inequality is limited, I think, from doing things this way and not making those benefits more generous, which is what I'd like to see. I'm more interested actually by the global version, because I think the power to reduce inequality is actually really significant, because this is billions of people who don't receive anything at all from Social Security, although, as you say, some countries have been doing this very, very well, but many countries haven't. So I think if you're going from zero to them being given $10 a month, was it? I think I'd be really interested to see the effects of that on, projections, because I think that could make a real difference. So I think where there's no Social Security, our Social Security system is very flawed. However, it is providing income to many of the lowest income households. Where you don't have a Social Security system, I think it could be really powerful.
Yeah, which is at the moment internationally there are basically no mechanisms to redistribute wealth internationally. Nationally, we have tons. We have tax and spend. There aren't any internationally, which is a huge part of the problem. And so, yeah, a basic income and then the kind of the funding mechanisms to gather up the money for it. That's completely new, and therefore, yeah, it's not trying to replace something that's already doing that. It's totally new.
Great. Any more from the floor?
Could I just ask, has anybody looked at the figures for quantitative easing per head versus basic income? Sorry. Has anybody looked at I'm just interested in what the figures are for how much has been spent now on quantitative easing per head of population given to the banks compared to how much it would have cost to give that money in basic income?
We had an answer from the front of it's about 10,000. per person. And another answer from the front saying they've heard 6. Has anyone on the panel looked into those numbers? No. Sorry, I didn't catch that.
How would that compare with figures per head for basic income?
Well, if it's between 6 and 10,000, that's sort of a couple of years of basic income at the rate that's being talked about. So it's pretty significant. It would certainly be a big help towards funding it if you did a kind of people's quantitative easing instead. I think some countries have experimented with that. I'm sure Australia gave everyone $200 instead of giving it to the banks. I think it's a good mechanism.
Has anyone else on the panel got a comment on that mechanism?
I think it's just the point I was making, really, that all of this thing, the £50 billion that were used to bail out the banks originally, you could have transferred that money to people. The worry was that people would, the political worry was not really the banks, it was the mortgages of voters. But we chose to give the money to the banks, and then quantitative easing has carried on. And the problem that the economy and the Chancellor has been struggling with is that they keep pushing this money to the banks, and it doesn't get distributed out because nobody can either, if they're relatively modest incomes or poor, they can't borrow or they daren't borrow. So only the rich can borrow, but the rich don't spend. So this is one of the things that has always driven the kind of social justice angle of Keynesianism, is it always makes more sense to redistribute money to people, ordinary people, because that money goes back into the economy and then leads to more positive exchanges. So, that is definitely one of the key arguments for basic income. But it is entering a kind of paradigm shift in the way we think about money, really. And so I think that's another mental challenge that goes along with this, and will take a bit of, that we've got used to the idea that these huge towers that dominate the London skyscape are there for a reason. Yeah, that there are clever, intelligent people doing wonderful things as our economy goes to shit. So it's a huge trick, kidology, that we will really struggle to get over. And of course, those people have an investment in the political machine. Part of the reason for setting up an independent think tank in Sheffield and not in London was you saw how dependent London think tanks are on money. Demos, London left-wing supposedly think tank, wrote a report on why we should have welfare cash cards funded by MasterCard. Right? So a lot of the debate around public policy in this country has been corrupted by government and by commercial interests. And that's one of the challenges, just breaking free in our thinking from some of this conventional wisdom that isn't so wise.
I think quantitative easing is a very complex issue which we don't fully understand. And it seems to be finally running its course, and there seems to be the beginnings of a shift away from it. But I think what we do know is that the quantitative easing, on the scale which it was engaged in, what it prevented was a kind of 1930s style crash and depression. So it was actually a means to maintain the existing political economy, to preserve as much of it as was possible without fundamental reform. And in that, it succeeded. It succeeded pretty well, but at the expense of the build-up of political pressures. And we're seeing now the political pressures bursting out because the quantitative easing kept the system afloat, but at the same time, the living standards of the majority have either stagnated or got worse, and we've had all this austerity and pressure on welfare spending, so that it's we haven't had the kind of political economic breakdown that we had in the 1930s. That was averted by the actions that were taken in 2008-9, but the fundamental problems of this political economy were not resolved by quantitative easing. It was a means of just keeping the system going. And we're now at that point where we still haven't had a full economic recovery. Economic growth is still very patchy, below trend, and productivity throughout the Western economy is really low. And this has huge implications for how this system can be kept going in the future. But politically, I mean, as we were hearing earlier, we're in a very dark place because the forces, the progressive forces, are fragmented in almost every country and are not in the ascendancy anywhere in the Western world.
Right, we are starting to run out of time now. We have just got time for one question. There's someone who's been waiting very patiently at the back already with the microphone. So,
yeah, I wondered, given the number of pilots elsewhere in the world for basic income, what would be the practical steps for a pilot for basic income in Sheffield?
who wants to go first?
I think that's Simon's.
Well, I must say, so if you like the idea of basic income, you should go to the Basic Income UK website and just endorse the statement we put up there. So one of the things we're trying to do is, before 2020 general election, is develop more awareness and support for this. So that's just a simple action anybody can do. In terms of practically developing it in Sheffield, off the top of my head, I think you'd have to create a very small pilot, wouldn't you? You'd have to, and again, I suppose the key element would be I don't think you can easily create a pilot on our own, but you could create, in the spirit of a kind of world basic income, you could maybe get people to crowdfund some people having secure income with no marginal, free some people from the benefit system, or you could research some of that actually in practice where people are experimenting with it. And you could just do some general, we did this at the Equality Trust, just do some general polling in the public to get people to think about what choices they would make and make people more aware. So I don't know, I think I'd have to go and have a drink and have a little bit more thought. You can't change the DWP's behaviour on your own, because that's controlled by the bastards. And so you'd have to create some kind of simulacrum of that somehow, and I'd have to think about how one would do that. Most people, unfortunately, are trapped because they're dependent on that system, and that system both penalises them if they're not seeking work and also punishes them if they do voluntary work. So the very things you'd want to encourage are actually forbidden by the system we've got. So it is very hard to do kind of on your own.
Yeah, it's all about the funding mechanisms, right? You have to have some means of getting the money, but there's various things that you could do. So you could have a Sheffield currency, and the beauty of having your own currency, I mean, this in the way that you've been talking about, making references to positive money and quantitative easing, is that you effectively all money is effectively created from nothing, pretty much. But when you create, you can create that money and hand it out to the people of Sheffield. So it might only be spendable in Sheffield, so it might be a limited basic income in the sense of what you could buy with it. But you could probably buy quite a wide range of goods if it was across the whole city. So that could be one interesting way of funding it. An idea I know that we've looked at in the Green Party is called progressive council tax. So that you effectively vastly increase council tax and then refund everybody, pretty much everybody except the very high earners or the people in very, very expensive houses, and that is effectively a way of raising more money locally, so you could then redistribute the surplus from that as a basic income. But essentially, at the end of the day, most of the funding mechanisms that we have in the country run from the local to the national and back to the local. So unless you can intercept those funding loops, the ability to do these sort of things locally tends to be dependent on goodwill, charitable funding, crowdfunding, or very small schemes that you can manage. So what we really need is a whole UK pilot, a whole country pilot, and I don't think we need to limit ourselves to to just Sheffield. I live in Manchester. I want a basic income as well. So.
Do we have any final roundup comments from our panel on anything we've discussed so far? No, awesome. Then I declare the bar open. In the spirit of Simon's having a drink and thinking about it, we are closing the official panel portion and Q&A of the event. The bar will remain open though, and I know several of us will be hanging around for a pint, so do join us. Thank you.